Chinese President Xi Jinping is in the U.S. after 6 years. This will be the first face-to-face meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Xi since the Bali summit back in 2022. In the much-anticipated meeting that is expected to last for 3 hours, the two sides are likely to discuss the two ongoing wars in Europe and the Middle East, the U.S.'s Taiwan policy, trade, and the rising military tensions between the two nations in the Indo-Pacific region. This is the first time since the year 2011 that the United States is hosting the annual Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Leaders from the 21-member Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group will gather in San Francisco to talk about how to better spur trade and economic growth across the Pacific region. However, the key highlight of the forum is the Biden-Xi meet, coming at the backdrop of the various incidents which have stretched ties between the two countries, starting from the Chinese spy balloon over the U.S. to military activities in the Indo-Pacific region. The two leaders have a lot to discuss. When it comes to trade, the first thing experts predict the two leaders will address is the semiconductor race. In the global market, China emerges as the largest market for semiconductors. In October of 2022, export restrictions imposed by the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands triggered concerns about potential misuse of imported equipment. However, the Semiconductor Industry Association urged stronger coordination among allies so that a common playing field is maintained across the industry. Meanwhile, people from both China and the United States hope that the expected meeting between their leaders will ease the recent tensions. This is a humble restaurant on a Beijing street that was a talking point in U.S.-China ties. Back in 2011, then Vice President Joe Biden went for lunch here. The meal sparked a social media trend which was later dubbed as Biden's noodle diplomacy. Over a decade has passed since then, and while American Chinese food is a hit, their ties slide towards a miss. Speaking on the current state of relations, a passerby near the eatery said the two leaders need to learn to get along for the sake of the world.
他肯定是以捍卫本国利益为主，所以说可能有一些做出的决策让我们无法理解，所以就是希望这次会议可能给双方带来一个沟通的平台。
Okay, joining us live from San Francisco, California is VOA's Jessica Stone. We're also being joined by Edward P. Joseph, Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and Foreign Policy Analyst. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you. Jessica, what are the big highlights of the day?
Well, the really big highlight, as you've outlined, is the Xi-Biden summit, which is going to take place about an hour's drive from here in San Francisco at a very well-known and historic estate by the name of Filoli Estate. And what's in particular very interesting about this estate is that part of the property that these two leaders will be able to walk literally is the San Andreas Fault, which is where the tectonic plates from the Pacific meet the tectonic plate from North America. And so in many ways, the tectonic relationship between these two countries and the tectonic implications for the global economy will be on full display. We expect it to be closed to press, but probably some pictures released afterwards. These two leaders meeting a total of 4 hours, as predicted by the White House, which will include a working lunch, a walk around the property, and meetings with their top-level national security officials, after which we should see a press conference with the U.S. media and the foreign media from U.S. President Joe Biden. And we hope to get more details about the outcomes there. But look, Washington is not holding high hopes for major outcomes here, the likes of which we've seen in the past decade of this relationship. They want basically two things. They want Beijing to put pressure on Iran not to have Hezbollah enter the fight in Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East. And they also want there to be a reopening of military-to-military communications, because during that Chinese spy balloon incident, Washington claims they could not get a hold of Beijing on the phone and through any of the communications channels. And they want to reopen those, particularly in the event of an escalation in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and the rest of the Indo-Pacific. Susan?
Jessica, stay with me, please. Edward, I'd love to get your thoughts on some reports coming in saying that for Xi Jinping, meeting Joe Biden is secondary to really coming to the United States and ensuring U.S. industries, that China is open for business considering the economic turmoil that it's facing in the country.
Susan, I think you've pointed to exactly the key consideration, both for President Biden and for President Xi. This meeting comes as basically each president is facing crises, but very different crises. For President Biden, of course, these are international crises, both in Ukraine and, of course, in Israel with the ongoing military operation against Hamas in Gaza. For President Xi, it is a severe domestic economic turndown that has changed dynamics in the situation. And President Biden himself alluded to this just recently. He alluded to this again, where he believes the United States is actually in a position of advantage. He said so recently, that the United States is in a position of advantage relative to China because of China's economic woes. Now, the other element here, of course, is that where this meeting takes place. This meeting takes place in the United States. That means President Biden wants to have concrete outcomes that help him domestically with his reelection 1 year away. And one of those key issues, Susan, is going to be actually on one that resonates with many Americans across the country, in Middle America and on the coast, and that is the drug fentanyl. And there is hope, the U.S. hopes, that there will be agreement with China, a concrete agreement with China to regulate components of fentanyl. That's a big deliverable that President Biden hopes to point to, in addition to the wider hope of the administration, of course, to prevent any further downturn in relations between the United States and China. Please.
Jessica, what is the kind of reception that President Xi has received and is expected to receive? We do know that no Republicans so far have written to Biden on no concession either on trade or Taiwan, but there are reports that the president will be looking over his shoulder because of Republicans, notably those in Congress.
Well, certainly there's a lot of pressure from Republicans and from Democrats on President Biden to stay the course, not to appear soft or make any visible concessions, particularly because of the domestic and electoral concerns that your guest outlined. But San Francisco itself, it's pretty well known for being a bit raucous at times, very open-minded in a place where there are a lot of public protests. We've already seen thousands of people gather to the streets over the weekend. On a range of issues, everywhere from protesting the war in Israel and in Gaza to anti-trade, anti-free trade, anti-China, pro-China. And President Xi Jinping has really gotten the same kind of welcome from both sides. He's gotten the U.S.-China Friendship Organization lining the streets with U.S. and Chinese flags held hand in hand and flags and banners welcoming him. Whether or not he saw them, we can't be sure. But there's also been a number of protests as well. And I'm standing at a place where law enforcement tells us they typically gather, and they're expecting about 10,000 protesters today to gather here on the Embarcadero and walk up Market Street to the venue. And they are ready. There are lots of barriers up and lots of law enforcement from all over the state here ready to go to make sure that everything remains peaceful.
Very interesting. And finally, Edward, trade is an important aspect, maybe perhaps one issue that the American voter is looking at, and also for those in China as well. President Biden recently gave up a new digital trade rule with allies in the Indo-Pacific. There was hope that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework trade deal would be a substitute to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Donald Trump abandoned. So what now? And are we expecting any breakthrough in that regard?
It's another very valid point. The U.S., and President Biden has pointed to this, believes its strategy is working, both in terms of trade, as you suggest, the trade dynamics, developing trade relationship with U.S. partners in Asia, that those are the neighbors of China, that most of them which fear China's aggressive positions in the region. And the U.S. has been building on its economic and security relationships with these countries. And President Biden has pointed to this as well and said that this is successful. This is what has brought China itself to the negotiating table. So President Biden says. The interesting wider point here, China, is that the U.S. and China, it's a metaphor for the description that your other guest just pointed to, the fact that there are protesters and there are also those expressing friendship towards China. That is actually a metaphor for the relationship in itself, because we've seen the relationship go to very sharp confrontation, especially with the shooting down of the spy balloon back in February. Former House Speaker Pelosi's visit to China last year. Each of those brought tensions up very high. At the same time, we've seen President Biden send his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on missions to China to try to calm things and find a pathway to dialogue and communication. And again, that stretches also into the very important security sphere, where the U.S. will try to reestablish military-to-military communications as well. But the relationship is severely tested. There are upcoming elections in Taiwan. Taiwan remains, of course, a bitter bone of contention for China in its relationship with the United States. So again, it's a balancing act. The U.S., President Biden, trying to show a strong leadership, extract this agreement with China on fentanyl, and also maintain some floor beneath which the relationship does not sink and move towards active confrontation. Please.
Edward and Jessica, both, thank you so much for joining us on WION and giving us a perspective of what to expect regarding this meeting. And I look forward to speaking to both of you again very soon.
You're welcome.
You bet.